In 1815, the forces of Napoleonic France were in the midst of an invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. The Portuguese Prince Regent John VI and his incapacitated mother, Queen Maria I of Portugal, along with the royal Portuguese court and several regiments of armed guards, fled Lisbon for the Portuguese colony of Brazil to escape Napoleon's wrath. During John VI's rule in exile, he established the short-lived United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, elevating Brazil to an equal position to mainland Portugal within the empire. Once Napoleon's forces were kicked out of Iberia by the British, a revolution broke out in the cities of Porto and Lisbon by liberal reformers. Known as the Constitutional Revolution of 1820, the conflict led to the drafting of a new constitution for the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. The Cortes, or Parliament, who assembled in Lisbon to draft this constitution, were primarily composed of Portuguese delegates, with very few delegates from Brazil. These majority Portuguese delegates were disgusted at the concept of their former colony being raised to the same level as the Portuguese mainland. Their drafted constitution referred to the citizens of the United Kingdom, including those in Brazil, as citizens of the Portuguese nation, and included provisions that undermined Brazilian home rule, threatening the central government in Rio de Janeiro and potentially reducing Brazil to a colonial status once more. At the same time, John VI was still in Rio, where the Portuguese Prince Regent relaxed and savored life. The monarchy was, at the time, incredibly popular in Rio de Janeiro, and John VI enjoyed more freedom to go where he wanted and do what he pleased than in the heavily guarded Lisbon. However, those advocating the return of the royal court to Lisbon argued that it was not right nor dignified for John to govern from a colony. At the same time, Brazilian nationalists argued that Brazil's future should be decided by Brazilians and not by the Lisbon Cortes. Prince Regent Pedro of Bragança, son of John VI, known better by the name Dom Pedro I, acted on the advice of a newly convened Brazilian council, declaring the independence of Brazil in São Paulo in September of 1822. The Cortes rushed to dissolve Pedro's government, and likewise, Pedro was sympathetic to their calls to return to Lisbon and void the Declaration of Independence. However, it was clear that the people of Brazil would not turn back from independence, as even his personal guard of honor were vocal in support of the Brazilian cause. Within the month, the Empire of Brazil would be established, and John VI would be forced to send troops to Brazil to attempt to reclaim the rogue region. The troops were turned away by Pedro upon arrival, with the help of a quickly assembled Brazilian army, composed of mercenaries, civilians, and defecting Portuguese regulars. The Portuguese soldiers were returned to Lisbon, causing John VI to send even more troops, who would then fight the Brazilians in the northeast. The Portuguese, however, never even made it close to Rio, due to the overwhelming numerical advantage of defending Brazilian forces and the sheer size of Brazil compared to the size of the Portuguese naval and infantry contingents sent to quell the nationalists. Simply put, it was much less a war of independence and much more a matter of Portugal being dragged kicking and screaming out of Brazil. It took until 1825, 3 years later, for the Cortes to finally give up and recognize the Empire of Brazil. The resulting political situation was relatively peaceful as the Kingdom of Portugal continued practicing colonialism in Africa, India, and the Pacific, and Brazil attempted to forge a democratic empire on its own. In the wake of this debacle, John VI would pass away on March 10, 1826. With no heir, Dom Pedro, ironically, actually ended up inheriting the Portuguese crown and reigning for a short period of time as Emperor of Brazil and King of Portugal simultaneously. He quickly abdicated the Portuguese throne in favor of his daughter, but it would be funny to explore a timeline in which Dom Pedro continues to rule both Brazil and Portugal, despite how much it would run against everything Pedro fought for over the prior half-century and his own personal goals at the time. Instead, we're actually going to be exploring a different question. What if, in an alternate timeline, the aforementioned liberal revolutions in Lisbon spilled over and caused a political crisis in Portugal? And what if, as a result, Brazil gained a colonial empire? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help contribute to these scenarios, or just have ideas that you'd like to be made into videos, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. Thanks, and enjoy the video. So in 1808, the Cortes passed the Decree of the Opening of Ports to Friendly Nations and the Treaties of 1810, both of which greatly destabilized Portugal. These policies heavily favored British products, which, while beneficial to the British, of course, served to undermine many Portuguese merchants who were forming the bulwark of the sprouting bourgeois class in Iberia. As a response, the Supreme Regenerative Council of Portugal and the Algarve was formed by army officers and Freemasons, and sought to end British control and promote a Portuguese liberal home rule. Their efforts, although initially suppressed, sowed the seeds for future revolutionary activities. Influenced by the Triennial Liberal Revolution in Spain, revolutionaries ignited a massive revolt in Porto, which quickly spread across Portugal to Lisbon in the south. The revolutionaries demanded the return of the royal court from Brazil and the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. And they also sought to kick out the British and restore exclusive Portuguese trade with Brazil, reducing Brazil's status from a kingdom within the Portuguese United Kingdom to just a colony again. In our own timeline, the Supreme Regenerative Council was headed by General Gomes Freire de Andrade, Grand Master of the Grande Oriente Lusitano, and former general under Napoleon until Napoleon's defeat in 1814, with the objective, of course, to end British control of the country and promote the salvation and independence of the patria. Now, in 1817, some members of the Freemasons denounced the movement to the authorities, who arrested many suspects, including Freire de Andrade, who was charged with conspiracy against John VI. King John was represented in continental Portugal by a regency, then overseen by the British military authority headed by William Carr Beresford, which condemned the liberal revolutionaries. John VI then returned to Portugal unhindered, causing Pedro, whose sympathies laid with the Brazilians, to declare independence on his own. We've already gone over this in the intro. This was the split between a stable monarchist Portugal and a stable independent Brazil. But perhaps in our alternate timeline, John VI does not return immediately, fearing the wrath of the revolutionaries. The situation in Portugal without a king to ensure stability would become a battle between the British, who were blockading Porto and Lisbon and attempting to stabilize the situation, and the Supreme Regenerative Council, who, taking inspiration from the French and Trentino revolutions, were becoming increasingly liberal, anti-monarchical, and radical. After months of ignorance by John V, the British would become fed up and implore him to return to Portugal and restore the monarchy and conservative order. However, upon arriving in Lisbon, as he attempts to be rid of the Liberals and Supreme Regenerative Council and restore monarchical authority, radical anti-monarchy revolutionaries storm the palace and behead John VI. In the immediate wake of the assassination, Portugal finds itself teetering on the brink of anarchy. With the liberal factions beginning to split up just as they had in the French Revolution, the British would move swiftly to restore order in accordance with their close relations to the Portuguese, establishing de facto control over Lisbon and Porto, with British forces seeking to stabilize the region and transfer power in Portugal to a new Portuguese ruler, preventing a liberal revolution from overtaking another European state like it had in Spain, Italy, and France all those years ago. Thousands of miles away in Rio de Janeiro, Dom Pedro was now the heir to the throne. Pedro assumed the reins of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. However, his assumption of power was met with vehement opposition. Now, in our timeline, this was around the time that Pedro declared the independence of Brazil, and I propose that, in order to avoid the mess that was mainland Portugal, Pedro would do the same, just with a twist. Well, it could be argued that Pedro would see the duty of assuming the throne in Portugal and stabilizing the entire kingdom. I feel that without serious sway from the now shattered royal court and devoid of conservative forces that might resist Brazilian nationalism, Pedro would take the opportunity to make a bold move and rid himself of the proverbial ball and chain that was mainland Portugal. In this alternate timeline, Dom Pedro would declare the independence of the Empire of Brazil and install his young daughter Maria II as the ruler of Portugal, enlisting the British to protect her reign. Compounding this decision, the United Kingdom would be split between not just Portugal and Brazil, but the colonies as well. Pedro I would retain control over the colonies of Angola and Mozambique, creating for Brazil a sphere of influence in the South Atlantic and Southern Africa, while Maria II's domain would encompass all those colonies Pedro saw as either too costly or too far to control, the Algarves, Portuguese Guinea, and the Pacific colonies. This split ensured that the revolution would stay in Portugal, and that Brazil would enter the mid-1820s a sovereign power with economic reassurances and freedom from the mismanagement of leaders in Iberia. Now, I know how unrealistic this sounds. Why wouldn't Pedro just assume the throne of the United Kingdom and rule Portugal and Brazil? Well, for one, Pedro was a solidly Brazilian nationalist, and during his time in Rio, he had become disillusioned not only with the politics of Portugal and the royal court, but he had also relinquished his loyalty to Portugal, replacing that with a loyalty to the people of Brazil. This liberal revolution, in essence, gives Pedro an opportunity to start his own empire in Brazil, his own legacy, and retain the valuable colonies in Africa that Brazil relied upon to sustain its economy, and we'll get to more of that in a minute. This would also let him shift the responsibility of quelling the rebellion to his daughter and the British, and just push that mess to the side. I also know a handful of you are going to ask the question, but wasn't Dom Pedro an anti-colonialist? You're right, but at the same time, it's not that simple. Dom Pedro's anti-colonialism was primarily a product of Brazilian nationalism and the broader revolutionary movements in the Americas. His drive for independence, in our timeline, was fueled by a desire to free specifically Brazil from Portuguese dominance, rather than a wholesale rejection of colonialism as a concept. His anti-colonial sentiment was more about rejecting foreign rule over Brazil than opposing the idea of colonialism per se. These attitudes can be seen in other American nations as well. The creation of colonial empires by Mexico and the United States are evidence of this. These nations, despite their own fights for independence, established colonial dominions in the forms of the Mexican Empire, which controlled much of the modern-day west coast of the US and the diverse region of Central America for a time, and the United States, who annexed Hawaii, Alaska, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and held great influence in Liberia, Panama, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. The ruling class in Brazil, much like their counterparts in other newly independent states, were predominantly of European descent. They were raised in European diplomacy and customs, which normalized the concept of colonialism as a legitimate aspect of rule. Racial attitudes of the time also played a significant role. Dom Pedro, like many of his contemporaries, harbored the same prejudices poignant in that time period, which influenced his views on governance and civilization itself. Africans, as we know, were often seen as less civilized by European standards, and this perception extended to Angola and Mozambique. Pedro likely viewed those colonies as regions that required oversight from a far more advanced and stable power. In his view, Brazilian rule, rather than the unstable Portuguese rule, would provide the necessary governance that these regions lacked. The most obvious reason for his retention of the Southern African colonies, however, is the economic consideration. If Brazil's economy was to thrive on its own, the slave trade would need to be continued. The transatlantic slave trade was central to Brazil's economy, and Angola was the primary source of enslaved Africans by Brazil and Portugal. By controlling Angola, Brazil could secure and sustain its labor supply, ensuring stability in their agrarian economy. Slavery was, of course, an abominable institution, and tended to be worse in the Caribbean and Brazil, where deadly sugar production and mistreatment of Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian slaves led to high death tolls on plantations. Nonetheless, Brazil, unfortunately, had a disturbing reliance on slavery. In our own timeline, Brazil ended up being the last country in the Americas to outlaw slavery, doing so in 1888. Furthermore, Angola, the richest of Portugal's colonies, had long-standing economic ties to specifically Brazil, which superseded slavery. During Portuguese rule, Angola exported ivory and gold to Brazil, which were highly valued commodities in both local and international markets. Brazil, in turn, exported goods such as sugar, tobacco, and rum to Angola. These goods were used for consumption by the colonists, but were also bought and sold to the native Africans, both enslaved and free. Antonio de Saldanha de Gama, Count of Porto Santo, would become a pivotal figure during this period. A reformist disillusioned with the Portuguese monarchy after the Congress of Vienna, he had become increasingly critical of Portugal's treatment of its colonial subjects, particularly in Angola. Antonio was born in an influential Portuguese noble family. The Gama family had a long history of involvement in the political and military affairs of Portugal, dating back to the Age of Discovery, when his ancestor, Vasco da Gama, helped to find the sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope. I'd say that in our alternate timeline, he would likely support integration into Brazil, and this support was not unfounded. Angola, as mentioned, had more economic and social connections to Brazil than the distant and politically unstable Portugal. Mozambicans, too, would see the potential benefits of Brazilian rule over continued Portuguese domination. The promise of a more stable and prosperous future under Brazilian governance was favorable, as was the decreased distance between Brazil and southern Africa compared to Iberia. Now, Antonio da Gama was not only disillusioned with Portuguese rule, leading him to support Pedro in our alternate timeline, but interestingly, he was one of few European rulers within the African colonies who opposed the slave trade. At the Congress of Vienna, Antonio da Gama was involved in the signing of the Declaration of the Powers on the Abolition of the Slave Trade on the 8th of February, 1815. Now, Pedro obviously would not allow the abolition of slavery in Brazil. Slavery was way too economically important to Brazil's economy, and abolishing slavery at this point in time could just weaken Brazil and cause more instability in the country. For now, Pedro I has to focus on consolidating his newly independent empire. The same could not be said for Portugal. Under the eye of British protectors, Pedro's daughter Maria II began her reign in a tumultuous state. To put it bluntly, she struggled to maintain stability. As a young and inexperienced ruler, she faced pressure from both conservative factions and liberal reformers. With Brazil dissociating from Portuguese politics, the British would take the helm and remove Maria within several months, with the aim of installing a stable, more conservative leader to prevent another uprising and to end the waste of British resources on keeping Portugal afloat. The British installed Prince Miguel I, the seventh child of John VI. Miguel was known in our timeline for his absolutist tendencies. He was a figure who could stabilize the country through strong centralized rule. The installation of Miguel did not go unchallenged, though. His ascension sparked a significant backlash from, you guessed it, the liberal factions, who would obviously not take too kindly to an absolutist on the throne. Miguel would, of course, suppress the liberal reformers and try to prevent unrest in the city, but he would also, with the tacit diplomatic support of the British, launch a war against Brazil. Miguel viewed the loss of Portuguese colonies as a grave affront to the nation's prestige and power. Just as John VI launched an attack on Brazil months after its independence in our own timeline, Miguel would undoubtedly have done the same. The ensuing conflict saw fierce battles in Brazil and Angola. The Brazilian forces fought to defend their territory and maintain independence, bolstered by their nationalist fervor and the leadership of Dom Pedro. Interestingly, I'd say that Mozambique, due to its geographical distance from both Brazil and Portugal, would probably remain under Portuguese military control for nearly the entire duration of the conflict. Brazil, in this war, simply needs to focus more on strategically vital regions, which means that direct military engagements in Mozambique are an unnecessary risk. The geographically massive and well-defended Brazil managed, like in our timeline, to defend itself from Portuguese reconquest. And as the conflict escalated, Britain found itself in a precarious position. Continued involvement in Portuguese and Brazilian affairs means that Britain risks significant international backlash from the United States. In our own timeline, the United States passed the Monroe Doctrine only 1 to 2 years after the Brazilian War for Independence, and the sentiments and political framework that led to the doctrine were already well established and entrenched within the American political class of the time. If the British kept supplying and supporting Portuguese efforts to reclaim Brazil, or worse, directly involved itself in the Brazilian independence struggle, that could provoke earlier and stronger opposition from the United States, something which might spell trouble for the British economy. Over time, as Portugal continues to lose, Britain would begin to withdraw its support, focusing instead on its myriad of other colonial and strategic interests. The might and popularity of Dom Pedro's empire eventually, of course, overwhelms Portuguese forces, and Brazil's triumph in the conflict solidifies its independence, its borders, and its colonial grabs. Now, Brazil, once a colony itself, has become a colonial empire in its own right. Now, Pedro has to tackle the slave trade. The slave trade would continue throughout the plurality of Dom Pedro's reign, even in spite of growing international pressure, particularly from Britain. During this time, the British were in the midst of an anti-slavery crusade in the Atlantic. The British Navy formed a unit called the West Africa Squadron, whose entire purpose was to suppress the Atlantic slave trade by patrolling the coast of West Africa, after the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which banned slavery in the empire. Britain used the squadron not only to prevent slavers within their empire from continuing the practice, but also to prosecute and dispatch slave traders outside of British influence. This included the continued slave trade between Angola and Brazil. Now, Brazil has a very obvious legal defense against British intervention in its slave trade. The trade of slavery within Brazil and Angola was a domestic transaction within Brazilian territory, not international commerce subject to external regulation. But pressure from Britain is still going to play a factor here, especially considering the massive military, specifically naval inequality between the powers of Brazil and Britain. Still, the Brazilian elite, reliant on slave labor, staunchly defended the abhorrent practice as long as possible. So with the increased political and financial capital that Brazil and her colonies now hold, Dom Pedro can direct resources towards consolidating Brazilian control over territories such as the Cisplatina, which is present-day Uruguay. Brazilian efforts in the Cisplatina Wars in modern-day Uruguay and Rio Grande del Sur were bolstered by African and Arab mercenaries recruited from Angola and North Africa. In this alternate timeline, perhaps we see more mercenaries being brought into the fray on the side of Brazil to supplement its young and inexperienced conventional army, and perhaps even more advanced weapons and foreign military commanders, like how the United States used foreign French and German commanders in its War for Independence and subsequent wars. I could see the conflict going either way, but a Brazilian victory would probably keep Pedro in power and in favor with the elites for a bit longer than in our timeline. Still, I believe the same underlying conditions that caused Pedro to fall from grace with the Brazilian elites would do the same in this alternate timeline. Pedro I couldn't manage Brazilian politics, causing gridlock between the liberals and conservatives. His military campaigns sucked money from the agricultural sector, which made the landed elites particularly unhappy with him. In our timeline, Pedro decided to abdicate the Brazilian throne in 1831 in favor of his young son Pedro II. In this alternate timeline, the same would probably occur but 1 to 3 years later. Ironically, with the abdication of its founder, the Empire of Brazil would find exactly what it would need in this time of crisis: stability under a ruler with a calm demeanor, intelligence, and dedication to his country. Dom Pedro II's reign would become synonymous with progress and stability for the Brazilian Empire. In our own timeline, Dom Pedro II was born on December 2, 1825, and his early years were marked by a period of regency until he assumed full constitutional powers in 1840 at the age of 14, in spite of several mentors who had ambitions of their own for the Brazilian throne. Under Pedro II's rule, Brazil underwent significant economic and infrastructural development. Young Pedro recognized the importance of diversifying Brazil's economy beyond traditional reliance on sugar, focusing instead on promoting coffee production, which became a major export commodity. His reign saw remarkable advancements in the expansion of railroads, telegraph lines, and cable networks. Historical records also attest to Pedro II's adept political management, a clear contrast from Dom Pedro I. During his 49-year reign, he navigated the complexities of Brazilian politics by alternating support between the liberal and conservative parties. He made sure that both parties shared power and facilitated orderly transitions between the governments. It also served to prevent the liberals and conservatives from uprooting his control over the political system. However, Pedro II faced challenges, particularly regarding the issue of slavery. Personally opposed to slavery, Pedro II had actually freed his own slaves in 1840, yet he understood the economic complexities of abolishing slavery in a society heavily reliant on forced labor for its massive agricultural sector. It wasn't until 1888, during the regency of his daughter Isabel, that Brazil finally abolished slavery. This act liberated around 700,000 slaves, but did not provide compensation to slave owners, causing Isabel to lose the support of the aristocracy. So here we have an important decision to make. Will Pedro II, in this alternate timeline, abolish slavery and follow his own personal moral compass, or will he abide by the elites and maintain the morally corrupt institution which Brazil's entire war of independence and annexation of Angola were more or less motivated by? I'm going to take you through my train of thought here. So outside observers, such as researcher Eric Williams, have analyzed the economic impact of slavery on colonial economies. Williams argued that slavery played a pivotal role in the accumulation of capital that fueled Europe's Industrial Revolution, yet the persistence of slavery actually hindered long-term economic development in regions like the southern United States and Brazil. Studies such as those by economists Darren Acemoglu and James A. Robinson emphasize that extractive institutions like slavery are detrimental to sustainable economic growth and, more importantly, can hinder industrialization, echoing the challenges faced by Pedro II's reign. If Brazil keeps slavery, its economy will be unable to effectively industrialize by the late 19th century, and it'll fall behind the other great powers, potentially causing it to lose its colonial possessions. But if Pedro outlaws slavery, while there's a chance that Brazil might industrialize and modernize effectively, he'll lose the support of the landowning class and will likely be forced into a transfer of power to a corrupt liberal government like in our own timeline. I'm going to say that it's more realistic for Dom Pedro to still outlaw slavery during the latter half of his reign. This was already one of his prerogatives, but in our own timeline, it was when Pedro was away on vacation and Isabel was reigning in his stead that she enacted the abolition of slavery just a bit earlier than he would have wanted. With the abolition of slavery, regardless of at what point in time this comes during Pedro II's reign, freed slaves and their descendants, along with European immigrants, would contribute to Brazil's growing mestizo population. The cessation of the transatlantic slave trade would also lead to demographic changes in Angola, with a burgeoning mestizo population in Angola emerging alongside native Africans. Intermarriage between African elites and the Angolan bourgeois had and would continue to become increasingly common. However, Brazil's transition was not without challenges. In a bloodless coup, Brazilian elites would oust Dom Pedro II, leading to the establishment of a republican government. Some members of the monarchy, in the aftermath of the republic's establishment, would find refuge in Angola, where they settled as exiles. But most would remain in Brazil, including Pedro himself, where the Republicans were quite content with allowing them to live effectively as pensioners. The transition to a republic, of course, did not immediately resolve all of the challenges that Brazil was facing. Corruption ran rampant and hindered developmental efforts, although breakthroughs in industrialization began to take shape. With Angola's wealth of resources, including oil, diamonds, and agricultural products, Brazil found new economic opportunities. Industries like steel production, shipbuilding, iron refining, coffee production, and pharmaceuticals would flourish, enhanced by Angola's resource contributions. Brazil would probably turn to foreign nations for modern military technology, although it would still lag behind most European powers. Simultaneously, at the Berlin Conference, Brazil would likely push for something identical to the Pink Line from our timeline, and a connection between Angola and the underdeveloped and underdefended Mozambique colony. But unlike Portugal, Brazil would have no qualms about starting a war over the claim. It'd be a short conflict, with Britain taking control of the remainder of what we now know to be Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, and perhaps Portugal even regaining Mozambique in exchange for assisting Britain. Brazil would be monetarily compensated for the loss of its territory in Africa to the British and Portuguese, but some resentment would still linger. As the 20th century dawns, Brazil finds itself navigating the build-up to the First World War. In our own timeline, Brazil initially stayed neutral during the First World War, just like every other country in Latin America. But Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare ended up taking out several Brazilian merchant ships, leading to widespread protests in Brazil to join the war against the Central Powers. You see, the only reason Brazil had actually stayed neutral in the first place was due to the Hague Convention, of which Brazil was a signatory. Conventions 5 and 13 in particular essentially stated that neutral countries couldn't support belligerents in major wars with equipment or resources, nor allow them to dock in their ports. Now, since the wording here was particularly blurry, most neutral nations had to be extremely careful with how they traded with belligerents in the First World War, which is why the United States slowed its trade with Germany and the United Kingdom, and why the Norwegian ship Royal was in violation of the terms of neutrality simply for transporting timber to the British in 1917. You can learn more about this specific incident and the Zeppelin pirates who apprehended the Royal in my video on the LZ-66. Anyway, Brazil's entire reasoning for being neutral was to protect their export products, primarily latex and coffee at the time. And with German submarines sinking Brazilian ships, they were essentially being handed all of the economic penalties of the war without even participating. Thus, after the Brazilian steamship Piranha was sunk on April 5, 1917, protests erupted in the capital, and the president of Brazil was forced to declare war on Germany. In our alternate history scenario, I don't see a whole lot changing. While the exact circumstances surrounding how Brazil would be pushed to the edge by German unrestricted submarine warfare would be different, Brazil's entry on the Allied side would likely remain about the same. Brazil's involvement in our history was negligible during the war. They sent expeditionary forces to France mostly just to learn modern warfare tactics from the French rather than actually participate in the conflict. The Brazilian Navy engaged in an anti-submarine campaign across the Atlantic, which was fairly successful at patrolling the western coasts of Africa. While the Navy managed to destroy some German U-boats, most of the ship's crews fell ill with Spanish flu, failing to arrive in Gibraltar before the end of the war in 1918. Our alternate timeline is not going to change a lot. Maybe this more industrialized Brazil is able to quickly manufacture more ships and has a greater impact on naval campaigns in the Atlantic. Maybe the United States helps economically, sending overseers to work alongside the small Brazilian military-industrial complex. Or perhaps industrial tycoons from the American private sector invest more in Brazil. Until that point, most investment in Brazilian industry by Americans came in the form of involvement in the mining sector, as Brazilian raw material exports were easy to transport to the continental US and then to use in manufacturing. I could see a possibility for the Americans to invest more in railway construction, shipbuilding capabilities, and telephone networks, but I doubt this would truly have a life-changing effect on Brazil's economy going forward. With the end of the First World War, Brazil's history and its trajectory, as in our own timeline, have been marked by ambition, challenges, and missed opportunities. The legacy of slavery, deeply intertwined with Brazil's economic foundations, has caused social tensions, but has especially left Brazil with enduring economic scars. The irony of Brazil's journey towards prominence lies in its recurring challenges: corruption, political instability, and foreign interference, all of which seem to perpetually delay its ascent to superpower status. Yet, amidst these setbacks, the resilience of Brazil's people and the potential within are still there, hinting at a future where greatness might yet be within reach, awaiting the right circumstances and leadership to propel the nation onto the world stage. Brazil, looking ahead at the future, teeters on the brink of greatness, tantalizingly close, yet elusive. As the world prepares for another global conflict, as political ideologies form and foment, as caricatures take power on the European continent, Brazil will find itself at a crossroads. Where will the winds of change take this empire? Stay tuned for part 2 next week. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you really liked hearing about Brazil's colonial empire. You can support us on Patreon by following the link in the description, or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.